Taoiseach Leo Varadkar recently said that it is a far-right myth to claim that refugees in Europe are required to stop at the first safe country they arrive at.
The level of misinformation is very worrying, and no opinion is allowed misinformation, in my view. I even heard on the radio this morning, people saying that asylum seekers have to claim asylum in the first safe country they enter. That is a far-right myth that is being perpetrated broadly. People are not under any obligation to claim asylum in the first safe country they enter. It is possible under the Dublin regulation for people to be sent back to a country that they've already applied in, if that country will take them, but that's a whole other thing.
So according to Varadkar, it is misinformation and a far-right myth to say that refugees have to stop at the first safe country they arrive. This is a rather interesting statement, considering the fact that this exact claim has been made repeatedly by top Irish state officials and politicians from Varadkar's own government for years. For example, here is Fine Gael TD David Stanton spreading extremist myths in an Oireachtas committee meeting, according to Varadkar.
The Dublin Convention, Dublin regulations, is that whole process kind of not working at all? Is it just, you know what I mean, where people land in a member state and that's supposed to be where they don't move on to other member states?
That is a far-right myth.
This is particularly noteworthy because not long after these comments were made, Varadkar appointed David Stanton as a Minister of State for Immigration. So, in other words, Varadkar appointed a man to oversee Ireland's immigration policy shortly after that man had spread what he calls far-right myths and misinformation about asylum seekers, which seems rather odd, I think you'll agree. Similarly, Jim O'Callaghan, Fianna Fáil's official spokesman on justice, has also made the same claim repeatedly.
We know that under the Dublin Convention that when people arrive into a European Union country, they have to claim their international protection in the first place where they land.
That is a far-right myth.
Just on the immigration issue, obviously the Dublin Convention requires that if you're applying for asylum, you have to apply in your first port of call.
That is a far-right myth.
And here is Green Party MEP Ciarán Cuff saying the exact same thing.
The problems in that stem back to the Dublin regulation, which simply tells migrants that they have to apply for refugee status in the first port that they come to.
That is a far-right myth.
And the examples don't end there, we could go on and on. So according to Varadkar, numerous members of his own government from all coalition parties have spent years spreading far-right misinformation about refugees. That's not my claim, that's his claim. And in fact, so have senior Department of Justice officials. For example, here is Noel Waters in 2015, who was then the Secretary General of the Irish Department of Justice, making the same supposedly far-right claim.
There's also a wider issue happening here in what's known as the Dublin regulation, where people are, and you will be aware of this from the current issue around Europe, where people are expected and required to make their application in their first country, and then if they don't, they have to be removed.
But unfortunately, the problems for the Taoiseach don't end there, because it turns out that none other than RTE, Ireland's beloved public service broadcaster, has apparently fallen to the dreaded far right as well. As reported last year, the primary innovation, as it was viewed then, was that the country in which an asylum seeker first arrived would be responsible for processing them. In other words, if a refugee landed in Italy, they would have to stay there. The Dublin regulation has been updated several times since, but that core principle, known as the first country of entry criteria, remained. This is remarkable because it's Leo Varadkar's government that has repeatedly told us we need state broadcasters like RTE in order to fight misinformation.
I think at a time of misinformation and disinformation, and at a time when that is so often amplified online, the importance of quality media and the importance of public service broadcasting has never been so valid. And yes, that is RTE and the national media, but it's also local media.
So apparently, we need RTE to stop people from spreading dangerous misinformation, even though, according to Varadkar, RTE itself is spreading far-right misinformation in his view. And he even referenced the national media, which is also implicated in all of this, because as reported by the Irish Independent, EU law, known as the Dublin Regulation, stipulates that asylum seekers must remain in the first European country they enter, and that country is solely responsible for examining their applications. As reported by the Irish Times, the Dublin Regulation states that asylum seekers cannot choose the EU state where they would like to live, as their claim must be processed by the first state in which they arrive. From the journal.ie, that followed calls by Greece, Italy and Malta last month to overhaul the Dublin Regulation, whereby refugees must seek asylum in the first country they enter. From the Irish Examiner, sources have said that attempts to amend the EU's asylum regime, the so-called Dublin Regulation, which requires asylum seekers to make their applications to the member state they first land in, were rejected. Etc., etc., we could go on. Even the BBC makes the same claim.
The so-called Dublin Regulation is a key part of that system. It was designed to prevent asylum seekers from submitting applications to multiple EU member states. It stipulates that asylum claims should be processed by the country that played the biggest part in the applicant's entry to the EU, usually the country where they first arrived.
And it seems that unfortunately France's state-run media, France 24, has also become far-right as well, unbeknownst to anyone but the Irish Taoiseach.
Under the Dublin Regulation, asylum seekers have to register in the first EU country in which they arrive in.
And we could go over many more such examples. So to recap, according to Leo Varadkar, a claim that has been widely accepted as fact for years by numerous politicians in his own government, top Department of Justice officials, the entire Irish media, the BBC, European state media and more, has actually been far-right misinformation all along. Now, in a future video, we may well break down what the Dublin Regulation actually says and the proposed European Migration Pact that's supposed to replace it. But for now, it's simply worth noting that there are only two possibilities here. One, Varadkar is correct, in which case his own government colleagues and state-funded media friends are guilty of spreading misinformation for years by his own admission.
That is a far-right myth.
Or two, he's incorrect, in which case he is spreading misinformation now. But either way, his government should probably not be in the business of controlling the truth itself, I think it's fair enough to say. It also shows how you can hold a normal view which is widely accepted and taken for granted by everyone, and then one day wake up to find yourself labelled as some kind of far-right lunatic by the Taoiseach overnight, simply for saying what has been regarded as common sense and common knowledge for years. It reveals just how meaningless and hollow the far-right label is as it gets tossed around like confetti by our leaders. My name is Ben Scallan and you've been watching Gript Media. Make sure to follow us for more content like this.